the violin that played itself. Close your eyes and let the gaslight flicker. Tonight, we step into the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, where reason meets the impossible, and where the world's greatest detective faces a mystery that defies all logic. Welcome to Nap Stories. I'm your companion through the shadows and secrets of the past. Tonight, we follow Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson as they investigate a case that begins with music in an empty room and ends with truth stranger than any ghost story. So settle yourself comfortably, let the world outside fade to silence, and drift with us into The Violin That Played Itself. Chapter 1. The Midnight Melody. The November rain fell steadily on Baker Street, drumming against the windows of 221B with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor. I sat by the fire, attempting to read the evening paper, but my attention kept drifting to my companion. Sherlock Holmes stood motionless at the window, his tall, spare frame silhouetted against the gray light, his fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin in that attitude of intense concentration I had come to know so well. He had been standing thus for the better part of an hour, and I knew better than to interrupt. When Holmes was in one of his contemplative moods, conversation was not merely unwelcome, it was dangerous. The knock at the door, therefore, came as something of a relief. Mrs. Hudson appeared, looking somewhat flustered. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. A Mr. Edgar Whitmore. He says it's most urgent." "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes said without turning from the window. But I noticed a slight relaxation in his posture, a subtle shift that suggested interest, perhaps even anticipation. The man who entered our rooms was perhaps 50 years of age, well-dressed but disheveled in a way that spoke of recent distress rather than habitual slovenliness. His hair was silver at the temples, and his hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat. Rain dripped from his coat onto Mrs. Hudson's carefully maintained carpet. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I apologize for calling at such an hour, but I am at my wit's end. Something is happening in my house that defies all rational explanation, and if I do not find answers soon, I fear for my very sanity." Holmes turned from the window, his gray eyes suddenly alert with that peculiar intensity that transformed his entire aspect. "Pray sit down, Mr. Whitmore. Watson, perhaps some brandy for our guest. He appears in need of fortification." I poured a generous measure while Whitmore settled into the armchair, his hands still trembling. He took a grateful sip before speaking again. "I reside at Whitmore House in Kensington," he said. "It's been in my family for 3 generations. I'm a collector, Mr. Holmes, instruments primarily. Violins, cellos, rare pieces from across Europe. My collection is valued at over £20,000. "A substantial sum," Holmes observed, taking his own seat and reaching for his pipe. "But you have not come here to discuss insurance, I think?" "No." Whitmore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I have come because for the past week, every night at precisely midnight, one of my violins plays itself." The statement hung in the air like smoke. Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw his fingers tighten slightly on the pipe stem. "Indeed? And by plays itself, you mean?" "I mean exactly that, Mr. Holmes. The instrument sits in its case in my music room, locked away, untouched by human hands. And yet at midnight, music fills the house. Not random notes, but a melody. The same melody every night. Beautiful and terrible and utterly impossible. Have you witnessed this phenomenon yourself?" "Every night for 7 nights. I have stood in that room watching the case, and the music emanates from within it. There is no one there, Mr. Holmes. No hidden musician, no mechanical device. Just the violin and the music and the darkness." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "This particular violin, tell me about it." Whitmore's face grew even paler. "It's a Stradivarius. Made in 1704, known as Il Fantasma, the Phantom. It has a history." "All Stradivarius instruments have histories," Holmes remarked. "What makes this one particularly noteworthy?" "It was owned by a violinist named Alessandro Moretti in the 1820s. A brilliant musician by all accounts, but troubled. He became obsessed with the instrument, claimed it spoke to him, guided his playing. His performances grew increasingly erratic, brilliant one moment, discordant the next. Eventually he went mad. They found him in his rooms in Venice, the violin clutched to his chest, dead at the age of 32. Cause of death. The official report said heart failure. But there were rumors. Whitmore paused, struggling with himself. Rumors that he had been driven mad by the instrument itself. That it was cursed. Cursed, Holmes repeated, his tone carefully neutral. And you acquired this instrument when? 2 months ago at auction in Paris. The seller was an elderly Italian count disposing of his family's collection. I paid £8,000 for it. The most expensive piece I've ever purchased. His voice turned bitter. And perhaps the worst investment of my life. Why do you say that? Because ever since it arrived, my house has not been at peace. My wife complains of nightmares. My daughter refuses to enter the music room. The servants whisper of ghosts. And every night, that damned melody plays, the same haunting tune over and over. Holmes was silent for a moment, his eyes distant. Then he said, "This melody, can you reproduce it?" Whitmore nodded and began to hum, softly at first, then with more confidence. It was indeed a haunting tune, melancholic and strangely compelling, with an Eastern quality to the phrasing that suggested origins far from England. "Interesting," Holmes murmured when Whitmore finished. "And you say the violin is kept locked in its case?" "Yes. After the first night, I locked it myself. The case has not been opened since. Yet the music continues." "Yes." "Have you considered," I ventured, "that perhaps someone in your household is playing a cruel joke? A servant or—" "I have dismissed that possibility, Watson," Whitmore interrupted. "I have stood guard myself. My wife has been with me. We have searched every corner of that room. There is no one there. Nothing but the locked case and the music that should not exist." Holmes rose and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mr. Whitmore, I do not believe in curses or phantoms. But I do believe in facts, and your facts are sufficiently intriguing to warrant investigation. Watson and I will call upon you tomorrow evening. We shall arrive before midnight and witness this phenomenon for ourselves." Relief flooded Whitmore's face. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Thank you. I knew if anyone could solve this mystery, it would be you." After Whitmore had departed, clutching his hat and hurrying out into the rain with considerably more energy than he had entered, I turned to Holmes. "Do you really believe there's a rational explanation for a violin that plays itself?" Holmes smiled thinly. "My dear Watson, there is a rational explanation for everything. The universe operates according to natural laws, not supernatural whims. Our task is merely to discover which laws apply." He picked up his own violin from its resting place by the window and drew the bow across the strings experimentally. "But I confess, this case presents certain features of unusual interest." "Such as?" "The melody, Watson. That particular melody. Unless I am much mistaken, and I am rarely mistaken in such matters, it is a Venetian funeral dirge. One traditionally played at the burial of musicians." His eyes glinted in the firelight. "The question is not whether the violin plays itself. The question is, who taught it that particular song?" Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere across London, in a locked case in a darkened room, a violin waited for midnight. Chapter 2, Whitmore House. The following evening found Holmes and myself in a hansom cab, rattling through the wet streets of Kensington. The rain had ceased, but the fog had rolled in thick and yellow, turning the street lamps into dim halos of light that barely penetrated the murk. Holmes sat in silence, his lean face barely visible in the darkness of the cab. He had spent the day in research, disappearing into the British Museum after breakfast and returning only in time for our appointment. When I had asked what he had discovered, he merely touched his finger to his lips and said, "Patience, Watson. Let us first observe, then theorize." Whitmore House emerged from the fog like a ship from a gray sea, a substantial Georgian mansion set back from the street behind iron railings. Lights blazed from every window, as if the inhabitants sought to ward off darkness itself through sheer illumination. Edgar Whitmore met us at the door personally, his face drawn with exhaustion. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. Thank God you've come. It's happening again tonight, I can feel it. Your servants? Holmes inquired, handing his coat to a nervous-looking butler. I've given most of them the evening off. Only Jenkins here and Mrs. Crawford the cook remain. My wife and daughter are staying with my sister in Hampstead. I thought it best, given the circumstances. Very wise. And the violin remains undisturbed. Exactly as I left it. Come, I'll show you. He led us through a hallway hung with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, up a broad staircase, and along a corridor to a heavy oak door. The music room beyond was spacious and elegant, lined with glass cases containing instruments of every description. Violins, violas, cellos, even a magnificent harp stood like silent sentinels in the lamplight. But it was the case at the center of the room that drew the eye. It sat upon a mahogany table, a thing of dark leather and brass fittings, locked with a substantial padlock. Il Fantasma, Whitmore said quietly. Untouched since I locked it 7 days ago. Holmes approached the case with the care of a surgeon approaching a patient. He produced a magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the lock minutely, then the leather surface of the case, then the table itself. No scratches on the lock, he murmured. No dust disturbed on the table. The case has indeed not been opened. He straightened and turned to survey the room. Windows. Locked from the inside. I check them every evening. Chimney? Blocked off years ago. My father feared fires. Holmes moved about the room with quick, precise steps, examining the walls, the floor, the ceiling. He tapped the paneling in several places, listening intently. He inspected the other instrument cases, paying particular attention to a violin case that sat near the wall. This one, he said. What is it? A Guarneri. Nearly as valuable as the Stradivarius, though not as. Whitmore paused. Not as troublesome. May I see it? Whitmore unlocked the case to reveal a beautiful instrument, its varnish glowing warmly in the lamplight. Holmes lifted it carefully, turned it over, examined it from every angle, then placed it back with a grunt of satisfaction. The room appears secure, he announced finally. Watson, what time is it? I consulted my watch. 11:15. Excellent. Then we have time to make ourselves comfortable. Mr. Whitmore, I suggest we extinguish most of these lamps. If someone, or something, is to perform for us, let us not make them shy with too much light. Whitmore dimmed the lamps until only 2 remained burning, casting long shadows across the room. We positioned ourselves in chairs that afforded a clear view of the locked case, and there we sat in silence as the minutes crawled by. The house settled around us with the small sounds old buildings make, timbers creaking, pipes sighing, the distant tick of a clock in another room. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. At 5 minutes to midnight, Holmes leaned forward slightly in his chair. I noticed his hand slip into his coat pocket, though I could not see what he withdrew. The clock in the hall began to chime the hour. 1, 2, 3. Each note seemed to hang in the air longer than natural. At the 12th stroke, silence fell like a curtain. And then, impossibly, music began to play. It emanated from the locked case, just as Whitmore had described, the same haunting melody he had hummed for us the previous evening. The sound was clear and pure, the work of a master musician, and it filled the room with its melancholic beauty. I felt the hair rise on the back of my neck. Beside me, Whitmore had gone rigid with fear. But Holmes sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed not on the case from which the music came, but on something else entirely. The melody continued for perhaps 3 minutes, rising and falling with heartbreaking emotion. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it ceased. The silence that followed was profound. Extraordinary, I breathed. On the contrary, Watson, Holmes said, rising from his chair with sudden energy. Entirely ordinary once one understands the mechanism. He strode to the locked case and rapped on it sharply with his knuckles. The Stradivarius remained silent as it has throughout. The music came from elsewhere. But I heard it. Whitmore protested. We all heard it come from that case. We heard it appear to come from that case. The human ear is easily deceived as to the source of sound in an enclosed space. Holmes moved to the wall near the Guarneri violin. The music actually originated here. He pressed his hand against the paneling and I heard a soft click. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow space beyond, barely more than a closet, but large enough for a man to stand in. And standing there, his face pale with shock, was a young man holding a violin. "Good evening," Holmes said pleasantly. "I believe introductions are in order. Mr. Whitmore, allow me to present your midnight musician. Unless I am much mistaken, this is your nephew, Gerald Whitmore." The young man's violin clattered to the floor. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Whitmore stared in disbelief. "Gerald? But you're in Oxford, at university." "Actually," Holmes said, "he's been living in your walls for the past week. There's a servant's passage that runs behind this room, common in houses of this period. I discovered it this afternoon during my research at the Land Registry Office, where I examined the original architectural plans." He turned to the young man. "You've been most dedicated, I must say. Playing the same piece every night at midnight requires considerable discipline." Gerald Whitmore's face crumbled. "I didn't mean any harm. I needed the money." "Money?" Whitmore's voice was sharp. "What money?" "From the sale of the Stradivarius." Gerald's words came in a rush now, tumbling over each other. "I knew you'd never sell it willingly, but if I could convince you it was cursed, that it was dangerous, I thought you'd be glad to be rid of it. And then I could purchase it from you at a fraction of its value through a dealer I know in Paris. He's already agreed to buy it from me for £12,000. You scheming little—" Holmes held up a hand. "If I may, Mr. Whitmore, your nephew has indeed been scheming, but I suspect desperation rather than pure greed motivated his actions. Tell me, Gerald, gambling debts?" The young man nodded miserably. £5,000? To men who don't wait patiently for payment. I've been hiding from them, living rough. When I heard Uncle had purchased the Stradivarius, I thought if I could just create this phantom, this curse. You studied the instrument's history, discovered the story of Alessandro Moretti, and decided to build your deception around it. You even learned to play his funeral dirge. Quite the performance in every sense." Whitmore sank into a chair, his anger deflating into weary disappointment. "You foolish boy. Why didn't you simply ask me for help?" "I was ashamed," Gerald whispered. The room fell silent. Outside, the fog continued to press against the windows, and somewhere in the house, a clock ticked on. Holmes picked up the violin Gerald had dropped. The Guarneri, I realized, not the Stradivarius, and examined it critically. "An excellent instrument. Your playing does it justice. But I'm afraid, young man, that your career as a phantom violinist has come to an end." Chapter 3, The Second Performance. The confrontation in the music room stretched long into the night. Edgar Whitmore paced before the fireplace in his study, where we had repaired after the revelation, his face a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. Gerald sat hunched in a chair, his earlier bravado completely dissolved. £5,000, Whitmore said for perhaps the third time. "To think you would rather deceive me, terrorize your own family, than simply ask for assistance. I'm sorry, Uncle. I truly am." Holmes, who had been examining the contents of his pipe with apparent disinterest, spoke without looking up. "Mr. Whitmore, if I might make a suggestion. Your nephew has behaved foolishly, certainly, but he has also demonstrated considerable ingenuity and dedication. Perhaps these qualities could be redirected toward more legitimate pursuits." Whitmore stopped his pacing. "What are you proposing?" "That you settle his debts, at a cost to him, naturally. Let him work off the sum through employment in your business. I understand you have commercial interests beyond your collection." "Shipping," Whitmore admitted. 3 vessels in the Mediterranean trade. Then put the boy to work. Hard work, real responsibility, might succeed where university leisure has failed. Holmes finally looked up, his gray eyes sharp. "Of course, this is entirely your decision. I merely observe that sending him back to Oxford in his current state would be rather like throwing fresh meat to wolves." Gerald looked up with desperate hope. Uncle, if you would give me the chance, I swear I would. Be silent, Whitmore commanded, but his tone had lost some of its edge. He studied his nephew for a long moment, then sighed heavily. Very well. You will work passage on the Aurora. She sails for Constantinople in 3 days. Captain Morrison is a hard man who tolerates no nonsense. If you survive 6 months under his command, we'll discuss your future. But the Stradivarius stays locked away, and you are never to speak of this phantom business again. Relief flooded Gerald's face. Thank you, Uncle. Thank you. I won't disappoint you. You already have disappointed me. Now you have the chance to redeem yourself. Don't squander it. After Gerald had been dismissed to spend the night in a guest room under Jenkins's watchful eye, Whitmore poured brandy for Holmes and myself. I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Holmes. When I came to you yesterday, I genuinely believed I was dealing with the supernatural. To discover it was merely my nephew's greed and desperation is almost a relief. Human nature is often more strange than any ghost, Holmes observed, accepting the brandy. Though I must confess, the case presented several interesting features. The use of the hidden passage, the careful research into the violin's history, the consistency of the performance. Your nephew showed genuine talent for deception. Wasted talent, Whitmore said bitterly. Perhaps. Or perhaps merely misdirected. Holmes sipped his brandy thoughtfully. Tell me, have you actually played Il Fantasma since you acquired it? No. I'm not a musician myself, merely a collector. I appreciate the instruments for their craftsmanship and history, but I don't perform. Pity. A Stradivarius unplayed is like a thoroughbred kept in a stable. These instruments were made to create music, not to sit locked in cases. Holmes set down his glass and rose. But that is your affair, not mine. Watson and I should be going. It's nearly 2 in the morning. Whitmore showed us to the door himself, shaking our hands with genuine warmth. I'll send your fee round to Baker Street tomorrow. And Mr. Holmes, if you ever need anything at all, you have only to ask. The fog had thinned somewhat during our time inside, and we were able to find a cab with relative ease. As we rattled back through the sleeping streets of London, I turned to Holmes. You seemed remarkably lenient with young Gerald. Not like you to advocate mercy for a schemer. Holmes smiled thinly in the darkness. Was I lenient? I've sentenced him to 6 months of hard labor under a captain I happen to know has a reputation for working his crew to the bone. If the boy survives it, he'll emerge either reformed or broken. Either way, he'll never attempt such foolishness again. You know Captain Morrison? I've had occasion to make inquiries about Mediterranean shipping routes. Morrison's name came up. He's honest, competent, and absolutely merciless with layabouts and wastrels. Holmes settled back against the seat. Young Gerald will learn the value of honest work, or he'll learn he's not suited for any work at all. Either knowledge is valuable. We rode in silence for a time. Then I asked, how did you know about the hidden passage? Surely examining architectural plans wasn't enough. It was a strong indication, but not proof. The confirmation came from several small observations. First, the dust patterns on the floor near that section of wall, disturbed in a way that suggested regular use. Second, the faint smell of tobacco smoke in the music room, though Whitmore claimed he never smoked there. Third, and most tellingly, the position of the Guarneri violin case. I don't follow. It was placed directly in front of the hidden door, Watson. A man entering and exiting that passage would need to move it regularly. Yet it sat slightly askew on its shelf as if recently replaced in haste. And when I examined it, I found fresh rosin on the strings, indicating recent use despite Whitmore's claim that the instruments were purely for display. But the locked Stradivarius case, surely that was genuine evidence of supernatural activity? It was genuine evidence that we were meant to focus our attention on the Stradivarius while ignoring the actual source of the music. A classic misdirection, Watson. The amateur magician's first technique: draw the eye to the spectacular while the mundane performs the actual trick. I shook my head in admiration. You make it sound so simple. Most mysteries are simple, once one strips away the theatrical elements designed to obscure the truth. Young Gerald created a very effective piece of theater. If he applies that same creativity to legitimate business, he might yet make something of himself. The cab drew up before 221B Baker Street. As we alighted, I noticed Holmes pause on the pavement, looking back in the direction we had come. "Something wrong?" I asked. "Itch him?" "No, nothing wrong. Merely—" He trailed off, then shook his head. "Nothing, Watson. Nothing at all. Come, let's get inside. Mrs. Hudson will scold us for tracking mud on her carpets, but at least we'll be warm." Yet as we climbed the stairs to our rooms, I noticed Holmes remained unusually quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. I had seen that expression before. It meant something was troubling him, some detail that didn't quite fit. "You're not satisfied," I said as we entered our sitting room. Holmes went directly to his chair and reached for his pipe. "I am satisfied that we solved the case Whitmore brought to us. The phantom violinist has been revealed, the mystery explained. But there remain certain small inconsistencies that nag at me." He lit the pipe and drew on it thoughtfully. "The melody, for instance. Gerald claimed he learned it from researching Moretti's history. But that particular funeral dirge was never written down. It was an oral tradition among Venetian musicians. How would a university student in Oxford come to know it? Perhaps he found a recording? Or met someone who knew it? Perhaps. But Holmes did not sound convinced. And then there's the matter of timing. Gerald claimed he'd been living in the walls for a week, performing each night at midnight. Yet the servants mentioned strange sounds in the house for nearly a month before that. Small things, footsteps where no one walked, doors opening by themselves, cold drafts in sealed rooms. Old houses make strange sounds, Holmes. Indeed they do. And yet, he fell silent, staring into the fire. I knew better than to press him when he was in such a mood. Instead, I prepared for bed, leaving Holmes to his contemplations. When I looked in on him an hour later, he was still sitting exactly as I'd left him, wreathed in pipe smoke, his keen eyes fixed on something invisible in the flames. The case of the phantom violinist was solved. But for Sherlock Holmes, it seemed, some questions remained unanswered. And in Kensington, in a locked case in a darkened music room, Il Fantasma sat silent, keeping whatever secrets a Stradivarius violin might hold after 3 centuries of existence. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Visitor. 3 days passed in the usual fashion at Baker Street. Holmes occupied himself with the tedious matter of a missing will, which he solved in an afternoon through careful examination of watermarks and ink composition. I attended to my practice and wrote up notes on several of our recent cases. The affair at Whitmore House seemed to have concluded satisfactorily. Then, on the 4th morning, everything changed. I was finishing breakfast when Mrs. Hudson appeared with her particular expression of disapproval, the one she reserved for visitors she deemed unsuitable for respectable lodgings. "A foreign gentleman to see Mr. Holmes," she announced with a sniff. "Says it's urgent. I've put him in the sitting room, though he looks like he's been sleeping rough." Holmes, who had been consulting his commonplace books, looked up with interest. "Foreign? In what sense?" "Italian by his speech. And carrying a violin case, if you please." Holmes was on his feet instantly. "Show him up at once, Mrs. Hudson. Watson, I believe our case may not be as concluded as we thought." The man who entered was perhaps 60, with a weathered face and silver hair that fell past his collar. His clothes, though of good quality, were rumpled and stained with travel. But it was his eyes that arrested attention. Dark, intense, haunted by something that might have been fear or might have been madness. "Senior Holmes." His accent was thick, his English heavily accented. "Forgive the intrusion. I am Vittorio Moretti. I have come from Venice because of Il Fantasma." Holmes gestured to a chair. "Please sit. You've traveled far, evidently in some haste. Watson, perhaps some coffee for our guest." Moretti sank into the chair gratefully, clutching the violin case to his chest like a shield. "I saw in the Italian newspapers a small item about English collector purchasing famous cursed violin. I knew at once which instrument. I came as fast as I could." "You are related to Alessandro Moretti, the previous owner?" "His great-nephew. The violin has been in our family for generations, passing from musician to musician. always bringing great talent, always bringing great sorrow. His hands tightened on the case. I sold it to the French Count 3 years ago, thinking to break the curse. But the curse, Signor, does not break so easily. Holmes leaned forward. Tell me about this curse. Il Fantasma was crafted by Stradivari in 1704 for a Venetian nobleman whose daughter was a musical prodigy. She died young, before her 20th year, and the violin passed to other hands. Every musician who has owned it has heard the same thing. Music that plays when no one is present. The voice of the dead girl, some say, forever practicing her art. And your great-uncle Alessandro? Moretti's face darkened. He was brilliant, Signor. The finest violinist of his generation. But the violin consumed him. He claimed it spoke to him, taught him melodies no living person knew. His performances became legendary but also frightening. People said he played like one possessed. And then, one night, he played a concert that no one who heard it ever forgot. He performed a piece he said the violin had taught him, a requiem for the dead. When it ended, he collapsed on stage. He died 3 days later, raving about voices in the strings. A tragic story, Holmes said. But what brings you to London specifically? Because Il Fantasma is not finished, Signor. The violin chooses its players, and when it chooses, it does not let go. Moretti set the case he carried on the table and opened it, revealing another violin. This is the Moretti family violin made by my grandfather. A fine instrument, but ordinary. I have been playing it for 40 years without incident. But 3 nights ago, this violin began to play the same melody that haunted my great-uncle. The same funeral dirge he performed at his final concert. Holmes examined the violin with keen interest. The same melody that young Gerald Whitmore played at Whitmore House. Gerald Whitmore? Moretti looked confused. I know no Gerald Whitmore. The nephew of the man who purchased Il Fantasma. He was playing tricks, hiding in the walls and performing on a different violin to frighten his uncle. We caught him 3 nights ago. 3 nights ago. Moretti's face went pale. The same night my violin began to play by itself. Signor Holmes, I am not a fanciful man. I do not believe in ghosts, but I know what I have heard. Something is happening, something connected to Il Fantasma, and it is spreading like a sickness. Before Holmes could respond, there was a commotion on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson's voice rose in protest, followed by rapid footsteps. The door burst open to reveal Edgar Whitmore, his face flushed with exertion and fear. Holmes, thank God you're here. It started again. Last night at midnight the music returned. But this time, he stopped, seeing Moretti. Who is this? Vittorio Moretti, Holmes said calmly. The great-nephew of Alessandro Moretti. He has also been experiencing unusual musical phenomena. Mr. Whitmore, I presume Gerald has sailed for Constantinople? Yes, 3 days ago on the Aurora. That's why this makes no sense. The music room was empty, locked, exactly as before. But at midnight the melody played. Not from the Stradivarius case this time, from the instrument itself, somehow sounding through the locked leather. Moretti stood abruptly. It is as I feared. Il Fantasma is calling out. It wants to be played. By whom? I asked, unable to keep the skepticism from my voice. By whoever it has chosen. Moretti turned to Whitmore. You must destroy it. Burn it, break it, cast it into the sea. It is the only way. Destroy a Stradivarius worth £8,000? Whitmore's voice cracked. You're mad. My great-uncle was mad also at the end. Mad from the voice of that violin. Moretti's eyes blazed. I have come to warn you. I have come to beg you. Do not play it. Do not let anyone play it. The music it teaches is not meant for human ears. Holmes had been silent during this exchange, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Now he spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Gentlemen, I propose we conduct an experiment. Tonight we shall all gather at Whitmore House. We shall wait for midnight, and we shall observe what happens with clear eyes and rational minds. Mr. Moretti, you will bring your violin. Mr. Whitmore, Illinois Fantasma will remain in its case, locked and observed. and we shall see whether this curse is supernatural or whether there is a more earthly explanation." "You would risk it?" Moretti whispered. "I would risk anything in pursuit of truth." Holmes's gray eyes were hard as steel. "Watson, prepare your revolver. We may need it." "Against a ghost?" I asked. "Against whatever we find tonight, ghostly or otherwise. For I suspect, gentlemen, that this mystery goes deeper than hidden passages and ambitious nephews. There is something at work here that we have not yet understood. And tonight we shall bring it into the light." Moretti crossed himself. Whitmore clutched at the back of a chair for support. And Holmes smiled, that thin, dangerous smile I had come to know so well. The smile that meant he was finally on the scent of something truly interesting. Outside, the London morning continued its ordinary business, unaware that in a quiet sitting room in Baker Street, 3 men were planning to confront a mystery that had haunted musicians for more than a century. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot once more. Chapter 5. The Music Room at Midnight. Evening found us once again traveling through the London streets toward Kensington, but this time our party numbered 4. Vittorio Moretti sat across from Holmes and me in the cab, his violin case balanced on his knees, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. The lamplight caught his face in intervals, revealing an expression of profound dread. "You have encountered this phenomenon before in Venice?" Holmes asked, breaking the silence. "Once when I was a boy. My uncle, Alessandro's brother, inherited Il Fantasma after the funeral. He kept it for less than a month. The music drove him from his house. He sold it to a German collector who brought it north, and we thought ourselves free of it." Moretti's hands tightened on the case. "But the curse followed our bloodline. My father heard phantom melodies on his own violin. My sister woke screaming, claiming dead fingers plucked her cello strings while she slept. Yet you remained a musician? Music is in our blood, Senior Holmes. We cannot escape it any more than we can escape breathing. But we learned to fear it also." Whitmore House loomed before us, every window blazing with light as before. But this time, Edgar Whitmore met us at the door with a haunted expression that suggested he had not slept since our last visit. "It's upstairs," he said without preamble. "I haven't entered the room since last night. I couldn't bear to." "Your wife and daughter remain away?" "Yes, thank God. I sent Mrs. Crawford home as well. Only Jenkins is here and I've posted him downstairs. Whatever happens tonight, I want as few witnesses as possible." We ascended to the music room in silence. The door stood open, and the space beyond was exactly as I remembered it. The cases of instruments gleaming in the lamplight, the mahogany table at the center bearing its locked burden. Holmes moved immediately to the Stradivarius case, examining the lock with his glass. "Undisturbed. The dust pattern is unchanged. No one has opened this since we were last here." "Then how did the music play?" Whitmore demanded. "An excellent question." Holmes turned to survey the room. "Mr. Moretti, where would you be most comfortable?" The Italian gestured to a chair near the window. "There, if I may. Away from that cursed thing. Watson, position yourself by the door. Mr. Whitmore, I'd like you near the fireplace. I shall stand here, near the table." Holmes consulted his watch. "We have 40 minutes until midnight. I suggest we use the time to prepare ourselves mentally for what we may witness. Or what we may not witness," I added, still skeptical despite the strange events. Holmes shot me a sharp look. "Keep your mind open, Watson. The universe is full of phenomena we don't yet understand. That doesn't make them supernatural, merely unexplained." We settled into our positions as the minutes crawled by. The house around us was silent except for the ticking of the hall clock and the occasional creak of settling timbers. Moretti sat rigid in his chair, his violin case unopened beside him. Whitmore paced nervously until Holmes asked him to please remain still. At 15 minutes before midnight, Holmes extinguished all but 2 of the lamps. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room, and the glass cases seemed to hold darker secrets in their depths. "Mr. Moretti," Holmes said quietly, "when your violin played by itself 3 nights ago, describe exactly what you heard." "The funeral dirge. The same melody my great-uncle performed at his final concert." It lasted perhaps 3 minutes, then stopped abruptly. And the instrument was in its case? No, senor. It was on its stand in my music room. I watched the strings move as if invisible fingers plucked them. Fascinating. And you touched nothing? I ran from the room. Moretti's voice dropped to a whisper. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran like a child from darkness. The hall clock began its preliminary whirring that preceded the chimes. We all tensed. Steady, gentlemen, Holmes murmured. Observe everything. Note every detail. The clock struck midnight. 1, 2, 3. At the 6th chime, I heard it, a single note, pure and clear, emanating from the locked case on the table. Then another, and another. The funeral dirge began to play. The sound was unmistakable, impossible to attribute to imagination or acoustical tricks. The violin was playing inside its locked case, the melody rising and falling with heartbreaking beauty. I felt my scalp prickle with superstitious dread. Whitmore had gone white as chalk. Moretti crossed himself repeatedly, his lips moving in silent prayer. But Holmes was smiling. He moved swiftly to the case and pressed his ear against it. Then he straightened and crossed to Moretti's chair, gesturing urgently for silence. He pointed at the Italian's violin case. We all heard it then, a second violin playing in harmony with the first. Moretti's instrument, locked in its case just as the Stradivarius was locked in its, had joined the phantom performance. The two violins played together, their melodies interweaving like voices in conversation. The effect was both beautiful and profoundly unsettling. This was no trick with hidden passages, no nephew playing pranks. This was something else entirely. The music built to a crescendo, then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that seemed to echo with its absence. For a long moment no one moved. Then Holmes strode to the Stradivarius case and, before anyone could protest, produced a small tool from his pocket and picked the lock. "Holmes, what are you doing?" Whitmore gasped. "Solving the mystery." The lock clicked open. Holmes lifted the lid to reveal Il Fantasma resting in its velvet bed, untouched, exactly as it should be. Except for one detail. The strings were vibrating slightly, still resonating from their recent use. Holmes reached down and plucked one string experimentally. The note that emerged was pure and perfect. He picked up the violin carefully, examining it in the lamplight. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Absolutely remarkable." "You see," Moretti said urgently, "it is cursed, possessed. We must destroy it." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "we must understand it." He turned the violin over, studying the F-holes, the scroll, the bridge. "There is always a rational explanation, gentlemen. Always. The question is whether we have the knowledge to recognize it when we see it." He set the violin down gently and crossed to Moretti's case. "May I?" The Italian nodded reluctantly. Holmes opened the case and lifted out the family violin, holding it up to the light beside the Stradivarius. "Watson, bring me that lamp if you would." I brought the lamp closer, and Holmes examined both instruments minutely, comparing their construction, their varnish, their proportions. "Extraordinary," he said at last. "The sympathetic resonance is far stronger than I would have anticipated. But there's something else. Something in the varnish, perhaps, or the wood itself." "Holmes, you're speaking in riddles," I protested. He looked up, his eyes bright with excitement. "Am I? Then let me be clear. These violins are communicating with each other, Watson. Not through supernatural means, but through physical resonance of a type I've never encountered. When one plays, it causes the other to vibrate in sympathy. But the effect is amplified far beyond normal acoustical principles." "That's impossible," Whitmore said. "Improbable, perhaps, but not impossible." Holmes set down Moretti's violin and returned to the Stradivarius. "The question is, who or what is initiating the first sound? What causes Il Fantasma to begin playing at precisely midnight each night?" As if in answer, the violin in his hands suddenly thrummed with a single note. Holmes nearly dropped it in surprise. The note faded, then returned stronger, and with it came others, building once more into the funeral dirge. Holmes held the instrument away from his body, watching the strings move as if plucked by invisible fingers. His expression was no longer confident, it was troubled, perhaps even frightened. "This shouldn't be possible," he whispered. And in that moment, with Sherlock Holmes himself confounded, I felt the room grow suddenly cold. Chapter 6. The Resonance. Holmes stood frozen, the Stradivarius held before him like an offering, its strings vibrating with impossible life. The melody continued to pour forth, each note crystalline and perfect, and I watched with growing alarm as my friend's face went from troubled to utterly absorbed. "Holmes," I said sharply, "put it down." He didn't seem to hear me. His eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if he were listening to something beyond the music itself. His fingers moved involuntarily toward the strings. "Senior Holmes." Moretti's voice was urgent. "Do not touch the strings while it plays. My great-uncle made that mistake. Once you make contact, the violin will not let you go." That broke through. Holmes blinked, awareness flooding back into his eyes, and he set the instrument hastily back in its case. The music faltered and died, leaving us once more in silence. "Forgive me," Holmes said, and I heard a tremor in his voice I had never heard before. "I was distracted." "You were entranced," Moretti corrected grimly. "The violin was calling to you, offering to teach you its secrets. That is how it begins." Holmes closed the case firmly and stepped away from it, pressing his hands together as if to still their shaking. "There must be a scientific explanation. Sound waves, perhaps, or some property of the varnish that creates unusual vibrations. Stradivarius' exact formula has never been replicated. Perhaps it contains some element that—" "Science cannot explain everything, Senior Holmes," Moretti interrupted. "Some things exist beyond the reach of your microscopes and chemical tests. Everything can be explained." Holmes's voice was sharp, almost angry. "I refuse to believe in supernatural nonsense when the answer must lie in physics and acoustics." "Then explain how my violin, across a city, began playing the same night you confronted the nephew," Moretti challenged. "Explain how Il Fantasma plays its melody at precisely midnight, locked and untouched. Explain how the strings move with no hand upon them." Holmes had no answer. For perhaps the first time since I had known him, Sherlock Holmes stood silent in the face of a mystery he could not immediately solve. Whitmore sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "What am I to do? I cannot keep this thing in my house. My family will never feel safe here again." "You could sell it," I suggested. "To whom?" Whitmore looked up bitterly. "Who would purchase a cursed instrument? And even if I found a buyer, could I in good conscience pass this horror to another unsuspecting soul?" "Then we do as I said," Moretti insisted. "We destroy it. Break it apart, burn the pieces, scatter the ashes. End this curse once and for all." "No." The vehemence in Holmes's voice startled us all. He strode back to the table, his hands gripping its edge. "We will not destroy a priceless artifact out of superstitious fear. There is an answer here, gentlemen. A rational, scientific answer. And I will find it." "At what cost?" Moretti asked quietly. "My great-uncle sought answers also. He died raving, his mind shattered by whatever truths the violin revealed to him." Holmes met his gaze steadily. "I am not your great-uncle, and I do not believe in curses." "Then you are a fool, Senior Holmes. A brilliant fool perhaps, but a fool nonetheless." The tension in the room was palpable. I moved closer to Holmes, concerned by his unusual agitation. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion in the morning when cooler heads can prevail." "An excellent suggestion, Watson." Holmes straightened, visibly collecting himself. "Mr. Whitmore, I recommend you lock this room and allow no one to enter. Mr. Moretti, please keep your violin secured as well. I need time to research, to consult with experts in acoustics and instrument construction." "And if the music returns tonight?" Whitmore asked. "Let it play. Observe it, note the exact time and duration, but do not approach the instrument. Do not touch it. Do not even open the case." Holmes's voice was firm, controlled once more. "We shall reconvene tomorrow evening. By then I will have answers." We departed Whitmore House shortly after, leaving Whitmore to his troubled vigil and Moretti to whatever dark thoughts occupied a man who believed himself haunted by his family's curse. In the cab, Holmes sat in brooding silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You're troubled," I observed. "I am confounded, Watson, and I do not enjoy the sensation." He looked out at the fog-shrouded streets. "There are elements to this case that defy my understanding. The sympathetic resonance between the instruments I can accept. That is merely physics, however unusual. But the initiation of the sound, the precise timing, the specific melody that both instruments play, these things suggest either an intelligence at work or a mechanism so subtle I have failed to detect it. Could there be some kind of clockwork device hidden in the violin? I examined it thoroughly. There is nothing but wood, strings, and varnish. And yet," he trailed off, his expression distant. "And yet, when I held it, Watson, when the music began to play, I felt something. Not a vibration or a mechanical tremor. Something else. An invitation almost. As if the instrument were aware of me, aware of my presence, and was reaching out. Holmes, you're beginning to sound like Moretti." He smiled thinly. "I know. That's what troubles me most of all. I pride myself on rational thought, on empirical evidence. But this case is pushing me toward conclusions that my reason rejects even as my instincts insist they may be true." We reached Baker Street to find a telegram waiting. Holmes tore it open, read it quickly, and handed it to me without comment. It was from Gerald Whitmore, sent from Portsmouth before the Aurora had sailed. "Uncle must know. Stop. I lied. Stop. Never learned the melody. Stop. It came to me in dreams. Stop. 3 nights before I began playing. Stop. The violin taught me. Stop. Forgive me. Stop. Gerald." I looked at Holmes in shock. He's saying the violin communicated with him somehow? Even though he never touched it? So it would seem. Holmes took back the telegram and stared at it. The plot, as they say, thickens considerably. He spent the remainder of the night in research, pulling down volumes on acoustics, on the construction of stringed instruments, on the history of Stradivarius and his contemporaries. I retired eventually, but when I woke at dawn, I found him still at his desk, surrounded by books and papers, his face haggard with exhaustion. "Holmes, you must sleep." "I cannot sleep, Watson. Not until I understand this." He gestured at his notes. "I've been through everything, every text on instrument construction, every paper on sound propagation and resonance. And I've found something interesting." "What?" "Stradivari worked during a period called the Maunder Minimum, a time when solar activity was unusually low. Some scientists believe this affected tree growth patterns, making the wood from that era particularly dense and resonant. But there are also accounts, scattered through obscure journals, of other strange phenomena during that period. Unusual weather patterns, reports of mass hallucinations, and a higher than normal incidence of what were called prophetic dreams among musicians." "You think there's a connection?" "I think there may be properties of matter and energy we don't yet understand. Properties that were accidentally captured in the instruments Stradivari created." He rubbed his eyes wearily. "Or I think I'm grasping at straws because I refuse to accept that there might actually be something supernatural at work." Before I could respond, Mrs. Hudson appeared with the Morning Post. Among the usual correspondence was a letter with an Italian postmark, addressed to Holmes in an elegant hand. He opened it and read in silence, his expression growing increasingly grave. Finally, he passed it to me. The letter was from a Professor Giacomo Bellini at the University of Padua, written in response to an inquiry Holmes had apparently sent days earlier. "Dear Mr. Holmes, your questions regarding Alessandro Moretti's final performance intrigue me greatly. I have researched the matter in our university archives and discovered something that may be of interest. The piece Moretti played that night, the funeral dirge that drove him mad, was transcribed by one of the audience members, a music scholar. The transcription still exists. What makes it remarkable is that the melody contains mathematical patterns that should not exist in music composed before the 20th century. Specifically, it incorporates fractal structures and frequency relationships that were not discovered until decades after Moretti's death. In short, Mr. Holmes, Moretti played a piece of music that could not possibly have been composed in his era. Where it came from, how he learned it, remains a mystery. I remain at your service should you require further information. Professor G. Bellini. Holmes and I sat in silence, the letter between us. Finally I spoke. Holmes, what if Moretti is right? What if this violin is truly cursed? He looked at me with eyes that held equal parts determination and dread. Then, Watson, we are dealing with something far more dangerous than I anticipated. And tonight, when we return to Whitmore House, we may be placing ourselves in considerable peril. Should we bring reinforcements? Lestrade, perhaps. What would we tell him? That we're investigating a haunted violin? Holmes shook his head. No, Watson. This is our burden to bear. Yours and mine. Whatever happens tonight, we face it together. Outside, London was waking to another gray morning, unaware that in a quiet room in Baker Street, two men were preparing to confront a mystery that reached beyond death, beyond time, beyond the comfortable boundaries of what reason could accept. The violin was waiting, and at midnight it would play again. Chapter 7. The pattern emerges. Holmes spent the day in a state of feverish activity I had rarely witnessed. He sent telegrams to musicologists in Vienna and Paris, consulted with a professor of physics at Cambridge, and even visited the British Museum to examine records of Stradivarius' workshop practices. I accompanied him on some of these errands, watching with concern as his usual methodical approach gave way to something approaching desperation. "You're pushing yourself too hard," I observed as we returned to Baker Street in the late afternoon. "Time, Watson, is not our ally in this matter." He consulted his watch for perhaps the 20th time that hour. "Every midnight that passes brings another performance, another opportunity for the violin to extend its influence. If my theory is correct." "Which theory?" "You've proposed half a dozen since this morning." He smiled grimly. "The one I haven't yet spoken aloud because it sounds like the ravings of a madman." He paused on our doorstep. "Tell me, Watson, do you believe it's possible for an object to retain memory?" "Memory? Objects don't have minds, Holmes." "Don't they? Consider a photograph. It retains the memory of light. A phonograph cylinder retains the memory of sound. What if certain materials, under certain conditions, could retain more complex information? Not just images or sounds, but patterns of thought, emotion, even consciousness itself." I stared at him. "You're suggesting the violin contains the consciousness of its previous owners?" "I'm suggesting nothing of the sort. Consciousness requires a brain, a nervous system. But patterns, pure information, those might persist in materials we don't fully understand. The wood, the varnish, the precise tensions in the strings. What if they form a kind of medium like the wax on a phonograph cylinder, capable of recording and playing back information?" "That's extraordinarily speculative even for you." "I know. That's why I haven't voiced it until now." He opened the door. "But it would explain why the violin plays the same melody repeatedly. Why it seems to teach that melody to other instruments and even to people like young Gerald. It's not alive, Watson. It's a recording. A ghost, if you will, but a ghost made of vibrations and resonance rather than ectoplasm and superstition." Mrs. Hudson met us with another telegram. Holmes read it and his face brightened slightly. "From Professor Bellini. He sent the transcription of Moretti's funeral dirge, and he's included an analysis of its mathematical properties." Holmes spread the pages on the table. "Look at this, Watson. The melody contains what he calls self-similar patterns, structures that repeat at different scales. The same mathematical principles that govern the branching of trees and the formation of snowflakes. I don't see how that helps us. Because nature produces these patterns spontaneously, through physical laws we're only beginning to understand. If the violin has somehow captured a natural process, if it's resonating with fundamental patterns in the universe itself, then what we're hearing isn't music composed by any human mind. It's the sound of mathematics made audible." "Holmes, you've lost me entirely." He looked up from the papers, his eyes intense. "The violin isn't cursed, Watson. It's simply found a frequency, a pattern of vibration, that exists independent of human will. Like a bell that rings at a certain pitch when struck, Il Fantasma has been shaped to resonate with this particular mathematical pattern. And once it begins, it induces the same resonance in other instruments nearby. But what initiates it? Why does it begin at midnight? That I don't yet know. But I have several hours to theorize before we must return to Whitmore House. He glanced at the clock. It's nearly 5. We should eat something, prepare ourselves. Tonight will be demanding. We dined lightly, though I noticed Holmes barely touched his food. As darkness fell over London, he packed a small bag with various instruments, a tuning fork, a stethoscope, several glass vials, and his ever-present magnifying glass. You're planning to conduct experiments during the phenomenon? I asked, if I can do so safely. I need to measure the vibrations, analyze the frequencies, understand the physical mechanism at work. He paused. Though I confess, part of me shares Moretti's fear. There's something about this case that troubles me on a level deeper than mere intellectual curiosity. We arrived at Whitmore House at 9:30, giving us ample time to prepare. Whitmore met us at the door, looking even more haggard than before. Thank God you've come. Last night was unbearable. The music played for nearly 10 minutes, and I swear I could hear harmonics, overtones I'd never noticed before. It was as if the house itself was vibrating in sympathy. Were you alone? Yes. I sent Jenkins away. I couldn't bear to have anyone else witness it. He led us upstairs. Moretti is already here. He arrived an hour ago with his violin and a priest. A priest? Father Antonio from the Italian church in Clerkenwell. Moretti insisted. He wants the violin exorcised. We found the music room transformed. Candles burned in every corner, and a small elderly priest in black vestments stood near the window, clutching a Bible and muttering prayers in Latin. Moretti sat in the same chair as before, his violin case at his feet, his face drawn with exhaustion. Senior Holmes, he said, rising, Father Antonio has agreed to perform a blessing, to cleanse this room of whatever evil resides here. Holmes's jaw tightened. Mr. Moretti, with all respect to Father Antonio, I don't believe exorcism is the solution. This is a physical phenomenon, not a spiritual one. You are entitled to your beliefs, Senior Holmes. I am entitled to mine. Moretti's voice was firm. My family has suffered from this curse for generations. If there is any chance that prayer might end it, I must take it. The priest approached Holmes, speaking in heavily accented English. You are the detective, yes? The man who solves mysteries with reason and logic. I am. Then perhaps you can tell me, sir, how does reason explain a violin that plays music no living person taught it? How does logic account for melodies that appear in dreams? Father Antonio's eyes were kind but penetrating. I do not ask you to believe in demons or spirits, but can you at least accept that there are mysteries beyond the reach of science? Holmes met his gaze steadily. I can accept that there are mysteries we don't yet understand, Father, but I cannot accept that understanding is impossible. Every phenomenon, no matter how strange, operates according to natural laws. Our task is to discover those laws. Very well. Then we shall each address this matter in our own way. Father Antonio moved to the center of the room, opened his Bible, and began to recite prayers in Latin. Holmes turned away, setting up his instruments on a side table. He positioned the tuning fork, arranged the glass vials in a precise pattern, and placed the stethoscope near the Stradivarius case. I checked my revolver, though I had no clear idea what I might need to shoot at. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me. A detective, a priest, a frightened collector, and a haunted Italian musician, all gathered to confront a piece of wood and strings. The clock struck 11. Father Antonio's prayers grew more fervent. Holmes adjusted his instruments with meticulous care. Moretti sat with his eyes closed, his lips moving soundlessly. At midnight, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I saw my breath mist in the candlelight, though the fire still burned in the hearth. Holmes, I said quietly, do you feel that? The cold? Yes. Another phenomenon to document and analyze. But I heard the tension in his voice. The hall clock began its preliminary whirring. We all turned toward the table where the Stradivarius case sat, dark and silent. Midnight struck. 1, 2, 3. At the sixth chime, the music began. But this time it was different, louder, more complex. And it wasn't coming from just the Stradivarius. Every instrument in the room began to sound. The cellos hummed with deep, resonant notes. The violas added their voice. The harp strings shimmered with cascading arpeggios. And over it all, the violins, both Il Fantasma and Moretti's family instrument, played the funeral dirge in perfect, impossible harmony. Father Antonio's prayers faltered. Whitmore gasped and backed against the wall. Moretti covered his ears, tears streaming down his face. And Holmes stood transfixed, his instruments forgotten, listening with an expression of awed horror. "It's not one pattern," he whispered. "It's a symphony of resonance, spreading from instrument to instrument, each one adding its voice to the whole." The music built and built, growing louder, more intense, until the very air seemed to vibrate with sound. The candles flickered wildly. The windows rattled in their frames. And then, at the peak of the crescendo, every instrument fell silent. The silence was absolute, crushing. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. Then Moretti's violin, still locked in its case, played a single pure note that seemed to hang in the air forever. And I heard it, we all heard it, a voice woven into that note. Not words exactly, but meaning. A message of sorrow and longing and desperate need. Holmes's eyes went wide. He took a step toward Moretti's case, then another, moving as if drawn by invisible strings. "Holmes, no." I grabbed his arm. He shook me off with surprising strength. "Don't you hear it, Watson? Don't you understand? The violin isn't cursed. It's not evil. It's lonely." He reached for Moretti's case. Chapter 8, The Truth in the Strings. "Holmes, stop." I lunged forward, but he had already opened the case. Moretti's violin lay there, its strings still vibrating with that single, sustained note. The sound seemed to fill not just the room but my very skull, resonating in my bones. Holmes reached for the instrument, and Father Antonio cried out, "In nomine Patris." But Holmes's fingers were already on the strings. The moment he made contact, his entire body went rigid. His eyes rolled back and he gasped as if struck. I seized his shoulders, trying to pull him away, but he was immovable as stone. "Holmes, for God's sake, man." His eyes focused again, but they were seeing something beyond the room, beyond me. When he spoke, his voice was distant, dreamy. "I understand now. I can see it all. The wood remembers, Watson. The wood remembers everything. Moretti, help me." Together, the Italian and I tried to break Holmes's grip on the violin, but his fingers were locked around it as if frozen. Father Antonio pressed forward, holding his Bible like a shield, chanting prayers in rapid Latin. But the violin continued to sound, that single note stretching impossibly long, and through it I could almost hear what Holmes claimed to hear, a voice ancient and sad, speaking in a language older than words. Then Holmes began to play. His fingers moved across the strings with a skill I had never known he possessed. The funeral dirge emerged, but transformed, elaborated, each note crystalline and perfect. His bow hand moved with the precision of a master, drawing sounds from the instrument that seemed to transcend mere music. "He's entranced," Moretti whispered, his face pale. "Just as my great-uncle was. Senior Holmes, you must stop. You must put it down before it's too late." But Holmes played on, his eyes closed now, his face serene. The melody shifted, evolved, became something new. And as he played, the other instruments in the room began to respond. The Stradivarius in its locked case, the cellos and violas, even the harp, all of them joining in a symphony that no human composer had written. Whitmore had collapsed into a chair, his hands over his ears. Father Antonio's prayers had become a desperate litany, and I stood helpless, watching my closest friend slip away into a mystery I couldn't follow. The music reached a crescendo, all the instruments crying out together in a chord that seemed to split the very air. Then Holmes's playing changed again. The funeral dirge faded, replaced by something else, a melody I had never heard, yet which felt somehow familiar. Bright where the dirge had been dark, joyful where it had been mournful. And as this new melody poured forth, I saw something extraordinary. The temperature in the room, which had dropped so dramatically, began to rise. The oppressive atmosphere that had weighed on us lifted like fog in sunlight. The candles, which had flickered and guttered, now burned steady and bright. Holmes opened his eyes. They were his own again, clear and focused. He continued to play, but now with conscious intent, shaping the melody with purpose. And the other instruments responded, their sympathetic resonance creating harmonies that were complex yet somehow inevitable, as if the music had always existed and was merely being discovered rather than created. Finally, gently, he brought the piece to a close. The last note faded into silence, and this time the silence was peaceful, complete. No lingering vibrations, no phantom voices, just the ordinary quiet of a room at night. Holmes carefully, reverently, set the violin back in its case and closed the lid. His hands were shaking. "Holmes?" I moved to his side. "Are you yourself?" "I am, Watson, though I am not entirely certain I was ever not myself." He looked around at the assembled company, at Moretti's tear-stained face, at Whitmore's shock, at Father Antonio's wonder. "Gentlemen, I owe you an explanation. And I owe Il Fantasma an apology." "An apology?" Whitmore's voice cracked. "To a violin? To the memory it contains, yes." Holmes moved to the Stradivarius case and opened it, lifting out the famous instrument with tender care. "This violin has been called cursed for over a century, but it was never cursed. It was mourning." "I don't understand," Moretti said. Holmes held the violin up to the light, and I saw something I had never noticed before, a slight discoloration in the wood near the scroll, almost like a water stain. Stradivari made this instrument for a young woman, a musical prodigy who died before her 20th birthday. We know this from the historical record. What we didn't know, what no one knew, is that she died playing this very violin. Her final performance was the funeral dirge that has haunted every subsequent owner. "How can you possibly know that?" Whitmore demanded. "Because when I touched Moretti's violin, when I allowed myself to truly listen to what it was saying, I heard her story. Not in words, Watson, but in pure emotion, pure memory, encoded in the vibrations of the wood itself." Holmes's voice was gentle, almost reverent. The wood absorbed her final performance, her fear, her sorrow, her desperate love of music even as death approached. And it's been trying to complete that performance ever since. Not from malice or evil, but from a kind of incomplete resolution. A song that was never properly finished. "That's impossible," I protested. "Wood can't hold memories. Can't it? We know certain crystals can store information. That's the principle behind your phonograph cylinder. We know magnetic materials can retain patterns. Why should we assume that wood, particularly wood as unique as that from the Maunder Minimum era, lacks similar properties?" Holmes set the Stradivarius down carefully. The varnish Stradivari used, the precise density of the wood, the tensions in the strings, all of these created a medium capable of capturing and replaying vibrational patterns with extraordinary fidelity. Not consciously, not with intelligence, but through pure physical resonance. Father Antonio spoke quietly. "And what you played just now, that different melody? A completion, an ending." Holmes looked at his hands, still trembling slightly. "When I touched the violin, I felt what it needed. Not exorcism or destruction, but resolution. The young woman's final piece had never been finished. She died before the last notes could be played. So the pattern remained incomplete, repeating endlessly, trying to reach its natural conclusion. When I played the resolution, when I gave it the ending it lacked, the cycle was finally broken." Moretti rose slowly from his chair and approached the Stradivarius case. "And now, is it at peace? Test it yourself." Holmes gestured to the instrument. "Play it if you dare." Moretti hesitated, then reached out and lifted the violin. He positioned it under his chin, raised the bow, and drew it across the strings. The sound that emerged was pure, beautiful, and entirely ordinary. No phantom melodies. No overwhelming resonance. just the voice of a superbly crafted instrument, waiting to be played. Tears streamed down Moretti's face. It's free. After all these years, it's finally free. As is your family violin, Holmes said. The resonance between them has been broken. The pattern has been completed. There will be no more midnight performances, no more dreams, no more voices in the strings. Whitmore sank into a chair, his face in his hands. I don't know whether to be relieved or disappointed. I purchased a Stradivarius with a legendary curse. Now it's simply a violin. Simply a violin? Holmes smiled. Mr. Whitmore, you possess one of the finest instruments ever created. Surely that's enough. Father Antonio closed his Bible and crossed himself. Mr. Holmes, I came here prepared to perform an exorcism. Instead, I witnessed something far stranger, a haunting cured not by prayer but by music itself. I'm not certain my theology has room for such things. Perhaps, Holmes suggested gently, your theology and my science are not as incompatible as we might think. You sought to bring peace to a troubled spirit. I sought to understand a physical phenomenon. In the end, we both succeeded, each in our own way. The priest smiled. Perhaps you are right. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and who is to say that science is not one of them? As we prepared to leave Whitmore House, Moretti approached Holmes and gripped his hand firmly. Senior Holmes, you have freed my family from a burden we've carried for generations. I cannot repay such a debt. There is no debt, Mr. Moretti. I did only what my nature compels me to do. I sought the truth. That the truth brought peace is merely fortunate. In the cab returning to Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence, staring out at the fog-shrouded streets. Finally, I could contain my curiosity no longer. Holmes, what did you actually experience when you touched that violin? You spoke of hearing her story, feeling what the instrument needed. Was that truly scientific observation, or was it something else? He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Watson, I have built my life on reason, on empirical evidence, on the principle that everything can be explained through logic and observation. Tonight, I experienced something that challenges those foundations. You believe the violin was truly haunted? I believe. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I believe that the universe contains phenomena we don't yet understand. I believe that information can be stored in ways we haven't imagined. And I believe that when I held that violin, I accessed information that existed not in any supernatural realm, but in the physical structure of the instrument itself. Whether that constitutes a haunting or simply an exotic form of data storage, I cannot say. But you heard her. You felt her. I experienced patterns of vibration that my mind interpreted as emotion and memory. Whether those patterns were truly her consciousness preserved in wood, or simply echoes of vibrations from a century ago, the end result was the same. I understood what was needed and I provided it. And the resolution you played? Where did that melody come from? Holmes smiled slightly. That, Watson, is perhaps the most unsettling part. I don't know. It simply emerged, as if the violin and I together discovered what had always been waiting to be found. Mathematics made audible, as I suggested earlier. Or perhaps, he trailed off. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Perhaps the truth is less important than the peace it brings. We reached Baker Street to find the first light of dawn touching the eastern sky. As we climbed the stairs to our rooms, Holmes paused and looked back at me. Watson, when you write this case up for your collection, I ask only one thing. What's that? Don't make it sound too much like a ghost story. My reputation as a rational man of science is fragile enough without people thinking I've gone in for spiritualism and table rapping. I smiled. I'll do my best, Holmes. Though I fear the truth is strange enough without any embellishment. The truth often is, my friend. The truth often is. Chapter 9, Echoes and Endings. A week passed before we heard from Edgar Whitmore again. The Morning Post brought an elegant envelope addressed to Holmes in a careful hand. He read the letter while finishing his breakfast, then passed it to me with a slight smile. Dear Mr. Holmes, I write to inform you that the events of last week have concluded in a most satisfactory manner. The violin has been silent since your intervention. No phantom melodies, no midnight performances, no sense of dread hanging over the house. My wife and daughter have returned home, and for the first time in months, Whitmore House feels like a place of peace rather than a prison. I have been playing Il Fantasma myself, or rather, attempting to. I am no musician, but even my clumsy efforts produce sounds of such beauty that I find myself moved to tears. It is as if the instrument, freed from its burden, now sings with pure joy. Mr. Moretti has also written to me. He reports that his family violin has similarly quieted. He plans to give a concert in Venice next month, the first time anyone in his family has performed publicly in 2 generations. He asked me to convey his deepest gratitude to you. As for the fee I owe you, I have taken the liberty of making a donation in your name to the London Conservatory of Music. I hope this meets with your approval. It seemed appropriate given the nature of the case. Your grateful client, Edgar Whitmore. A generous man, I observed, and a happy ending to a most unusual case. Is it an ending, though? Holmes had risen and moved to his violin, which rested in its customary place by the window. He picked it up and examined it thoughtfully. Or merely the conclusion of one chapter in a much larger story? You're being cryptic, Holmes. Am I? He drew the bow across the strings experimentally, producing a pure, clear note. Consider, Watson, Il Fantasma was created in 1704. It has passed through countless hands over more than a century, accumulating experiences, absorbing performances, collecting memories in its wood and strings. We resolved one haunting, but how many others might linger in its history? How many other musicians have left their mark on it? You think it might become troubled again? I think instruments, like people, have histories that shape what they become. But I also think that with proper care, with understanding and respect, those histories need not be burdens. He began to play, not the funeral dirge but a lighter piece, something by Mozart. Every violin carries the memory of every note ever played on it, Watson. Most simply lacked the unusual properties that made Il Fantasma's memories audible. I listened as he played, noting the skill with which his fingers moved across the strings. You've been practicing. I have. The experience of playing Moretti's violin, of feeling the music flow through me rather than from me, reminded me why I took up the instrument in the first place. There's something transcendent about music, Watson. Something that speaks to us on a level deeper than words or logic. That's remarkably poetic for you, Holmes. He smiled and set down the violin. Perhaps dealing with a haunted instrument has made me more appreciative of the living ones. He moved to his desk, where papers and notes from the case still lay scattered. I've been corresponding with Professor Bellini. He's fascinated by my theory about resonant memory in musical instruments. He's planning to conduct experiments with other Stradivarius violins, testing their acoustic properties for unusual patterns. You think others might have similar properties? Perhaps not to the same degree, but yes. The Maunder minimum produced unique conditions. The cold temperatures, the unusual density of wood from trees that grew during that period. Stradivari's varnish formula remains a mystery even today. Who knows what combinations of factors might have created other instruments capable of storing and replaying vibrational patterns. It sounds like the beginning of a new field of study. Indeed. Though I doubt it will be taken seriously by most of the scientific establishment. Too close to spiritualism, too easily dismissed as superstition. He gathered the papers and filed them away in his commonplace book. But I know what I experienced, Watson. I know what I felt when I held that violin. And I cannot dismiss it as mere imagination, no matter how much my rational mind might prefer to do so. There was a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson entered with another visitor's card. Holmes glanced at it and raised an eyebrow. Well. It seems our case has attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Watson, we have a visitor from the Royal Academy of Music. Professor Edmund Ashworth, no less. The man who entered was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He carried a violin case, which he set down carefully before addressing Holmes. Mr. Holmes, I apologize for calling unannounced, but I've heard remarkable stories about your recent case involving the Stradivarius called Il Fantasma. Stories that, frankly, I found difficult to believe. And yet you've come, Holmes observed, which suggests you have reason to think they might be true. Professor Ashworth opened his case to reveal a beautiful violin, its varnish glowing warmly in the morning light. This is the Rossetti violin made in 1708, also by Stradivari. It's been in the Academy's collection for 50 years, and for the past month, it has been exhibiting unusual behavior. Holmes leaned forward with interest. Define unusual. It plays by itself. Not every night and not always the same melody. But several students have reported hearing music coming from the instrument room when no one is present. At first, we dismissed it as pranks or imagination, but I myself have witnessed it twice now. Music emerging from a locked case from an instrument no one has touched. Holmes and I exchanged glances. He stood and moved to examine the violin Professor Ashworth had brought. Tell me, Professor, has the Academy acquired any other instruments recently? Particularly any from the same period? As a matter of fact, yes. A cello, made by one of Stradivari's students in 1710. It arrived 6 weeks ago, a donation from an estate in Yorkshire. Ashworth's eyes widened. You don't think? I think, Professor, that you may have inadvertently created conditions similar to those at Whitmore House. Two instruments with resonant properties, close enough to affect each other, perhaps responding to patterns encoded in their wood from centuries ago. Holmes handed the violin back. Tell me, does the music occur at any particular time? Usually in the early morning hours, around 3 or 4 o'clock. And the cello, where is it kept? In an adjacent room, separated only by a thin wall. Holmes smiled. Then I believe, Professor, that you have a similar phenomenon to the one we recently resolved. And if you're willing, I would be happy to investigate. Though I warn you, the solution may require methods that seem more musical than scientific. Ashworth clutched the violin case. Mr. Holmes, if you can bring peace to these instruments, I don't care if you dance naked around them chanting pagan prayers. The students are frightened, the staff is whispering about ghosts, and I'm at my wit's end. Then we shall pay a visit to the Royal Academy tomorrow evening. Watson, I trust you're free. Wouldn't miss it for the world, Holmes. After Professor Ashworth departed, promising to make all necessary arrangements, I turned to Holmes with a question that had been nagging at me. Do you really believe this will become a regular occurrence? Haunted instruments requiring your services. I believe, Watson, that we've stumbled upon a phenomenon that has likely existed for centuries but been dismissed as superstition or imagination. How many musicians have heard phantom melodies and been declared mad? How many instruments have been destroyed or hidden away because their owners couldn't explain their unusual properties? He picked up his own violin again, running his fingers along its neck. We may have opened a door to understanding something truly remarkable, not ghosts or curses, but a form of memory storage that predates any technology we've intentionally created. You sound almost excited. I am excited, Watson. For the first time in months, I have a mystery that challenges both my intellect and my assumptions about what is possible. There's nothing more invigorating than discovering that the universe is stranger and more wonderful than we imagined. He began to play again, and I settled into my chair with the newspaper. Outside, London continued its endless bustle, unaware that in a quiet room in Baker Street, a detective had discovered that music could be a mystery as complex and compelling as any murder. That evening, as darkness fell and the street lamps flickered to life, Holmes paused in his playing and looked out the window. You know, Watson, I've been thinking about what happened in that music room. About the moment when I touched the violin and felt connected to something beyond myself. Yes. I've spent my life believing that reason and logic were the highest achievements of human thought. That everything could be reduced to facts and evidence and deduction. But that night, I experienced something that transcended logic. Not in the sense of being illogical, but in the sense of operating on a level where logic alone wasn't sufficient to understand it. Are you saying you believe in the supernatural now? No. I'm saying I believe the natural world is far more complex, far more mysterious, than I previously allowed myself to admit. The patterns that exist in music, in mathematics, in the very structure of matter itself, they form a language that speaks to something deeper than conscious thought. And instruments like Il Fantasma, through some accident of material and craftsmanship, have learned to speak that language back to us. He set down his violin and turned to face me fully. We live in an age of science, Watson. An age that believes everything can be measured and quantified and explained. But perhaps we've lost something in that pursuit. Perhaps there's value in mystery, in the inexplicable, in the things that make us feel wonder rather than certainty. That's very philosophical for you, Holmes. Perhaps confronting a haunted violin has made me philosophical. He smiled. Or perhaps I'm simply learning that being the world's foremost consulting detective doesn't mean I have all the answers. Sometimes the questions themselves are what matter. I raised my glass in a toast. To questions then. And to mysteries that challenge us to think beyond our certainties. To mysteries, Holmes agreed, touching his glass to mine. May they never cease to surprise us. And in that moment, as twilight deepened over London and the first stars appeared in the clearing sky, I understood that our adventure with the violin that played itself had changed something fundamental in my friend. Sherlock Holmes, the man of pure reason, had encountered a mystery that expanded rather than reduced the wonder of existence. It was, I thought, perhaps the most important case we had ever solved, not because it saved lives or caught criminals, but because it reminded us that the universe still held secrets worth discovering. The next chapter of our adventures awaited. And somewhere in London, in the halls of the Royal Academy of Music, another violin waited to tell its story. But that, as they say, is a tale for another night. The mystery is solved, the music has found its peace, and Sherlock Holmes has learned that some truths require more than logic to understand. But the night is young, and countless other stories await in the shadows. If you've journeyed with us through the fog-shrouded streets and the haunted music rooms, if you felt the pull of the impossible and the comfort of resolution, then you know the magic that Nap Stories brings to your nights. Don't let this be your last adventure. Subscribe now and join us every evening as we explore mysteries that captivate your imagination while easing you into peaceful sleep. From the brilliant mind of Sherlock Holmes to the darkest corners of the unknown, we're here to guide you through stories that linger in your dreams. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on your notifications. Because tomorrow night we have another tale waiting, one that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. The best mysteries are the ones that change how you see things. And at Nap Stories, we have an endless collection waiting just for you. Until tomorrow night, sleep softly, dream deeply, and remember, the greatest adventures happen in the quiet hours before dawn. Subscribe to Nap Stories. Your next mystery awaits.